The interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project for the Library of Congress. The veteran's name is Philip Prince. He was born on August 4th, 1926. He served in the Army during both World War II and the Korean War. He achieved the rank of Staff Sergeant. We are recording this on November 22nd, 2013. My name is Zach Bruns, and I'm conducting the interview. I have no relation. Alright, Mr. Prince, so you were originally born in North Carolina?
Yes.
In Boston, North Carolina. What was it like growing up there?
Well, actually, I didn't grow up there. I've lived there for 2 years. My father worked for the railroad, which went through Boston, and it was the Clemson Railroad, and it was headquartered in Irwin, Tennessee. So when I was 2 years old, we moved to Irwin, and that's where I grew up, and that's where I was living when I first came to Clemson.
Okay. How old were you when you came to Clemson?
I was 18 years old. As a matter of fact, I turned 18 when I was at Clemson because I came in the second summer semester of 1944.
Okay.
When I turned 18.
Why did you choose Clemson?
I had a football scholarship.
You had a football scholarship. So you played in high school in Tennessee then?
Yes.
Okay. What position did you play?
Tackle.
You play tackle? Okay.
Right.
I guess you had to have been good then if you came out here and played.
Well, we had a good football program at Clemson back then. We weren't too much during 1944 and 45 because the team my freshman year was made up of 8 freshmen and 3 medically discharged veterans because all of those that were old enough and healthy enough were still in the service. But when I came back in 1946, our program got better, and in 1948, my senior year, we were undefeated and untied and played the University of Missouri in the Gator Bowl and won. Our coach back then, Coach Frank Howard, said we humiliated Missouri 14-13. So that was some of my football experience at Clemson.
Okay. So did you have any brothers or sisters or?
Yes, I was one of 4 brothers. All 4 of us served during World War II, and then I had 2 sisters.
Okay.
And my oldest brother, Palmer Prince, was killed by a Japanese kamikaze plane off of Okinawa. He was on the USS Hyman, a destroyer, when it was hit by a kamikaze plane, and my brother Palmer was killed. And my brother David, who was the one up from me, was wounded in the Battle of the Bulge in France in World War II. And my brother Gene also was in the Army, and of course I was in the Army and served in the Philippines.
Okay. So what was the Depression like for you then in Tennessee?
The Depression?
The Great Depression.
Well, we were lucky in one sense that our father was a conductor on the railroad, and that was considered an essential job, and luckily he was not laid off during the Depression, but so we were fortunate in that regard. Even though there were 6 children, we didn't have a lot, but we had enough.
Okay, so it didn't hit you too hard then?
No.
Okay, that's definitely good to hear. So when you came to Clemson, did you know that you would end up being called to active duty, or?
Well, I stayed in the Inactive Reserves, which at that time I thought was a good decision because I could accrue retirement benefits, and even though I wasn't serving actively in the Army, I would be eligible for some benefits if I stayed in for 20 more years. But of course the Inactive Reserves was among the first they called up for the Korean War.
Right.
So I went back in the service for an additional 10 months, but then when my term of enlistment ran out, I that was it. I was out of the Army for good.
Okay. So when you said you first came to Clemson in 1944.
Right.
Okay. So what was you came for the summer or the second summer semester, and then you were enlisted after that, or for World War II?
I didn't enlist. I was drafted.
You were drafted.
At that time, Clemson had 2 summer sessions. They had one the early part of the summer, and then I came for the second summer session, and I had actually started my the full fall semester when I turned 18 on August the 4th of 1944, and in October of 1944 my number came up in the draft and I went into service.
Okay.
That's when I served for 20 months and came back to Clemson in October 1946.
Okay. So were you in ROTC when you went to
Yes.
Clemson? Okay.
That freshman year I was in ROTC, and of course everybody was in ROTC at that time.
Right.
But then when I came back, veterans were not subjected, did not have to participate in ROTC unless they wanted to, and many of them did. But since I was playing football, I didn't rejoin the ROTC program.
Okay. So did the ROTC program, how did that prepare you for going into boot camp?
Well, I knew how to drill, and I knew how to, fall in and stand at attention and salute, and a lot of the basics. As a matter of fact, I guess because I had that brief exposure to the military way of doing things, I was made a platoon, an acting platoon sergeant for my basic training, because I knew the basics, and so they put me in charge of a training platoon, although I had no official rank other than just as a training position.
Okay. Where did just out of curiosity, where did you live on Clemson in that first little bit you lived there? We had I'm not sure whether it's still, is the quadrangle still there? Yeah, the quad?
The quad, yeah.
I think they redid it and updated it, but.
Well, we lived in one of those was considered the football barracks. Of course, everything was a barracks back then. It was not a hall.
Right.
Because it was still a full military institution at that time. Mm-hmm. And one of the buildings on the quadrangle was considered a football barrack. And that's where we lived my freshman year. Of course, when I came back out of the Army in 1946, I was no longer in the ROTC, but they still had a football barracks for the veterans, which made up most of the football team at that time. Although the freshmen and sophomores who had not been in the Army and were still in the ROTC, they had to stay in their barracks, wherever that might be on campus.
Okay. So, what all besides the basic things that you already had learned in ROTC, what did boot camp entail for you?
Well, boot camp was at Camp Blanding, Florida, which is still an active military base. It's called Fort Blanding now, and it's the center for the Florida National Guard. Okay. But when it was Camp Blanding during World War II, I was there for 9 weeks, and we went through all of the rigors of learning how to drill and the rifle range, and crawling through an obstacle course under machine gun fire, and everything that we had to go through in basic training. And from there I went to Fort Hood, Texas. The war was winding down, we felt like, and they had a rule at that time that well, anyway, I went to Fort Hood and for some advanced training as an anti-tank gunner. And and then I went to the Philippines and came back 9 months later.
Okay, so you were stationed, when you were at Fort Hood, did you know that you were going to ship out to the Pacific eventually, or where is it you?
Well, I knew that I felt like we were being prepared for the invasion of Japan.
Right.
And that's indeed what we were being trained for. And that advanced training as an anti-tank gunner was something I had not been exposed to in basic training at Fort Blanding, Camp Blanding. And so that was just some additional training before we went to San Francisco and got on a troop ship.
Okay.
And but the war ended when we were halfway across the Pacific, and it's a coincidence that the troop ship I was on called the Marine Tiger, and we were, as I said, we were halfway across the Pacific when the war ended. The second atomic bomb was dropped, and we had a battalion of combat engineers on board who had fought in Europe, and they had enough discharge points to get out of the Army, so we turned around and came back to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. We went out to the fort there, and they processed that combat battalion, and they could go back home and get discharged. We loaded back on the troop ship and started out for the Philippines again, and it took us, including the 9 days we spent in Hawaii, it was 31 days after we left San Francisco before we got to the Philippines. Because then we had to go straight across the Pacific instead of the Great Circle route that went up around near Alaska, which was the shortest route because of the shape of the Earth. And we had to go around the bulge to get there.
So what was it like sitting on a ship for an entire month?
Well, it wasn't too bad in a lot of respects, except when you had to go down and pull KP duty in the in the ship's mess, because we did have some jobs. We would have to sweep down the decks, and but most of the time was leisure time. I read several books and got to, when the weather was good, we'd go up on the deck and just find a place and stretch out and take the sun. And but then we also did have to, as I said, we had to scrub down the decks, and we had to pull KP duty in the mess hall, and but I recall it as not being too bad an experience.
Okay.
Except that the bunks, they were about the bunks folded down on chains from the wall, and there were about 4 bunks, and when you got in your bunk, unless you were on the top, then on the top you were looking up at the ceiling, but if you were in one of the middle bunks, you were about 12 or 18 inches from the guy that was sleeping above you. So it was sort of confining, but it was not too bad.
Okay. So once you got over to the Philippines, what did you do?
When I got to the Philippines, as I said, the war was over.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I had trained in the infantry at Fort Jackson and at Camp Hood, Texas, we went to when we got off the ship in Manila, we went to a repositioning camp, a processing camp outside of Manila, and they would look at your record and the fact that I had almost a full year of college at Clemson on my record, and that's the only reason I can think of why I got assigned the way I was. Of course, we had soldiers in the Philippines in every part of the Army, whether it be at staff or in the mess hall or in an active military unit or whatever it might be. They had fought, been a part of the Army since Australia, and they fought in Australia, or didn't fight in Australia, but they were stationed in Australia. Then they were part of the forces that fought in New Guinea and all the way up through the Pacific Islands, and then in the Philippines. So they had more than enough points to get discharged. So they put us just about anywhere, and I ended up replacing a master sergeant in the office of the chief quartermaster for the Western Pacific. I was in an office job. And I was lucky from that standpoint, but it was also, here I was, a private first class replacing a master sergeant with years of experience. So I did get to train under him for about 2 weeks, and then he left, and then I took over the job, and I was promoted to corporal and later promoted to sergeant.
Okay.
But I was responsible for ordering the supplies and equipment for the Army for the Western Pacific.
The entire Western Pacific.
Yes, and I was on the staff of a Colonel Manderbach, Manderbach. Colonel Manderbach was the chief quartermaster for the Western Pacific, and of course they were headquartered just outside of Manila, and it was a fairly, as a matter of fact, we were in the buildings that had formerly been the University of the Philippines, and the Japanese had used some of those as their headquarters when they occupied the Philippines, and some of the buildings had even been used to store demolitions and ammunition. And those buildings had been, of course, bombed and strafed and under cannon fire from the American forces when they landed. And so some of the buildings had been almost completely demolished, but my office was in one of the buildings that was still partially usable. And so we, as I said, we ordered and managed all of the quartermaster supplies for all the troops in the Western Pacific.
Okay. So what does that exactly entail, managing all the supplies?
Well, we, as I remember, we had tables that we went by. For this many men, you would order this much cans of beans and loaves of bread and tires for the trucks or whatever it might be. Requisitions would come into us, and then we would either order them out of stocks that usually the stocks were already on hand, but we would also decide when it had to bring more supplies well ahead of time from the States or from Hawaii to the Philippines.
Okay.
And of course there were still some supplies on some of the Pacific Islands that had been part of the battles coming across the Pacific Ocean.
Okay. So after you were the quartermaster there, you went back to Clemson?
Well, as I said, my oldest brother Palmer had been killed in the Navy, and they adopted a regulation or a rule that said that if you were overseas and a member of your immediate family had been killed, you could be reassigned to the United States just to be closer to your family. So I was transferred back to the United States, and this rule also said that you would be station, the nearest Army post closest to your home. Well, my home was in Irwin, Tennessee, way up in the eastern corner of Tennessee, and the nearest Army post was in Camp Polk, Louisiana, so that's where I went. It's now Fort Polk, Louisiana, and it's the headquarters for the Louisiana National Guard. But so that's where I was reassigned to Camp Polk, Louisiana, and since I had that experience in the Quartermaster Corps in the Philippines, they assigned me to the Camp Quartermaster at what was then Camp Polk.
Okay. Okay. So did your brother, was he killed after the treaty was signed then? Or?
Oh no. He was killed. He was killed in the treaty was signed in 1945, and he was killed in April of 1945.
Okay.
He was on a destroyer, the USS Hyman, and he was his assignment during battle was he was in charge of one of the anti-aircraft artillery sites on the ship, and that's where he was when a Japanese kamikaze plane crashed into where he was, and he was killed at that time.
Okay. The ship sounds familiar for me for some reason.
USS Hyman.
Mm-hmm. I can't think of why, but it sounded familiar to me. So after you were assigned to Fort Polk, how long were you there for?
I think I got to Fort Polk in like May or June of 1945, and I was there until, as a matter of fact, Coach Frank Howard was quite a gentleman, and anyway, he stayed in touch with all of his former players that went in the service. He would write us and stay in touch. So when he found out I was back in the United States at Fort Polk, Senator Strom Thurmond was, of course, a Clemson graduate, and Coach Howard, I think, contacted Senator Thurmond's office and said, could you arrange for Phil Prince to get a terminal leave? In other words, come back to Clemson before I was actually discharged. This was before terminal leave became a policy. Within the next year, if you had accrued leave, you could go home and be discharged after you'd been home for 30 days or whatever it was. Okay. So I came back to Clemson in September and started football practice and played in 2 or 3 games, and then I went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and got discharged in 2 days and came back to Clemson to finish my semester.
Okay. So then you were in what undergraduate degree were you pursuing while you were at Clemson?
I was I was undeclared my freshman year, right. And but I did decide to major in English literature.
Okay.
And so my bachelor's degree was in liberal arts.
Okay. And you played football for 4 years then?
Yes.
Okay. And went on to win the Gator Bowl, you said?
Yes. We were undefeated and untied my senior year.
Okay. What was that like, that experience for you?
Well, it was a great experience because at that time we played the University of South Carolina, who were playing this not this week, but in a couple of weeks. They were big rivals back then, and I don't know whether you're familiar with Big Thursday or not.
Not yet. I was converted to a Clemson fan when I got my acceptance letter, I guess I'd say.
Well, back in those days, the Clemson-Carolina game was, of course, a big rivalry.
Right.
And it was played on the Thursday of the state fair every year. So it was called the Big Thursday game. and it was a big deal in the state of South Carolina because in my freshman year we beat South Carolina at Big Thursday. And then I came back out of the service, and my sophomore and junior year they beat us, and but my senior year I turned out to be, I guess you'd call me the game's hero, because they were leading us 7-6 with about 8 minutes left in the game, and they had to punt. I broke through and blocked the kick, and our right end picked it up and ran it in for a touchdown, and my roommate kicked the extra point, and we beat them 13-7. So I was sort of a hero for a short time anyway, or for a long time. But anyway, that's been how many years ago? 54, 67 years ago. So it sort of faded from everybody's memory now, I think.
That's gotta be a great feeling, though.
It was.
Oh, I can't believe that's.
And we went on to be undefeated and untied that year and beat the University of Missouri, as I said earlier, in the Gator Bowl. And as Coach Howard said, we humiliated them 14-13.
Oh, that's something. That's cool.
Yeah.
So after you graduated from Clemson, where did you start going with?
Well, as I said, I had majored in English, and I also signed a football contract with the New York Football Giants, partially because I wanted to go to graduate, because my ambition at that time was to try to be a college professor at some point, and I knew I needed to get, at a minimum, a master's degree and probably a PhD in liberal arts. So I used my GI Bill to go to Columbia University in New York, and I'd signed with the New York Football Giants, and I played in 5 exhibition games with the Giants, and then and also enrolled at Columbia. But during my time with the Giants, I got my shoulder hurt, and ended up, when I got my shoulder back in shape, I ended up finishing out the season with the Jersey City Giants, which was a farm club of the New York Giants. I finished 1 semester at Columbia, and but I had met a young lady from Rock Hill, South Carolina, while I was at Clemson, and as a matter of fact, she and I had gotten engaged. And anyway, when I finished that first semester at Columbia, and I decided that pro football was not going to be for me, and she and I decided we would get married. So in March of 1946, we got married, and I took a job at teaching and coaching in Bristol, Tennessee. Got called back in the Army after we'd been married about 10 months, and our first son was born at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, when I went back in the Army. And then when I came out of the Army that time, I took a job with the Milliken Company plant in Abbeville, South Carolina. And we lived there for 5 years, and that's where our second son was born.
Okay. So what did you do during the Korean War when you were called back up? Well,
I was working in, gotta get my thoughts straight. We're talking about ancient history now.
Not too far long ago.
I was in, I was, I'm trying to remember where I was working when the Korean War started. I went to work in Abbeville in 1945. I was there for 5 years, 1950. Went to Burlington and Gastonia, North Carolina for a year.
What did you do up in Burlington?
Well, I left Milliken and Company and went to work for Burlington Industries.
Okay.
And I worked in Gastonia, North Carolina. Well, and then I worked. I was with Burlington for 5 years. Then I came back with Milliken, and went back in the Army during the Korean War in 1950, and that's when I played football for Fort Jackson. I stayed there for 10 months, and then when I came out, that's when I went to Abbeville, South Carolina, and worked for Milliken. I think I got my dates on.
That's right.
You might have to straighten that out. And, yeah, I went to work for Milliken in 1951. And then later went to work for Burlington, and then came back to Milliken and worked my way up through the ranks for 20-something years to be a vice president of human resources.
Okay. Okay. And from there, did you where did you go from there? Did you go to Clemson from there, or?
Well, no, I went to American Express as a senior vice president for human resources in New York, and my wife and I moved from Spartanburg to New York City and lived there for 5 years. We still had a home at Pawleys Island that we would come back to often, and during vacations and at Christmas time, and at least once a month we would have a weekend at Pawleys Island while we lived in New York. And I was with American Express for 5 years, and then I came to, I'd been an investor in a company called a real estate development company in Charlotte, and came to work for them in Charlotte as a vice president, and that meant we could spend weekends in Pawleys Island and spend a week in Charlotte when I was working, and then finally retired completely and moved to Pawleys Island.
Okay. So what you said you were president of Clemson from 94 to 98?
Yes. I was elected as a life trustee of Clemson in, I got to remember all my dates. In 1989, and 6 years later, and you might go back in the history books and check all these dates because I'm not. Dr. Max Lennon was the president, and Dr. Lennon left to go to the University of Kentucky, I think, and my fellow trustees asked me to step in because they wanted to take a lot of time to look for the next president. So they asked me if I would step in and serve as president, and they didn't call me a temporary president. They just said, you're going to be the 12th president of this university because we want you. At that time, we were carrying out a major restructuring and reorganization of the university.
Okay.
I don't know whether you read about this or not, but it's in the history of Clemson, or that I've got somewhere. Yeah, this one. That Dr. Reel wrote. And I had been instrumental in helping to design the restructuring of Clemson. We went from 9 colleges down to 5. We eliminated several dean's jobs. We put departments together that had never been together, like health and human development and history and literature and things. Anyway, you've probably read about some of this, what happened. But anyway, they asked me to come in and institute these changes in that year that I was president, and we did it successfully and without a whole lot of, I mean, it was upsetting to some people, but it, relatively speaking, it went very, very smoothly, and a lot of people have told me that Clemson would not have made progress in a lot of fields like automotive engineering and some other things if it had not been for that combination of mathematics and engineering and things like that, and also on the liberal arts side.
That's definitely, you can definitely see that now. Like Clemson's working with BMW, and that's a huge part of it. You can, it's all over campus, you can see all about it. So would you say like your time in service, did that contribute to your work ethic or anything, any kind of special skills you picked up that you use later on in life? Or?
Well, yes. I think anything that helps you to develop a discipline and a regimen, I think even playing football did that. It taught me teamwork. It taught me the value of each person contributing their own special skills and abilities to the goal of the organization, whether it be a football team, and then certainly in business, everybody has to be on board with the same goals and expectations, and a university the same way, which was one of the winning attributes that we got out of the reorganization and restructuring that we did in that year I was president, because it brought disciplines together that would not normally have been together and helped them present what you might call a united front to move things forward. And as I said earlier, I've had several professors and department heads say that they didn't realize how much progress they could make at first, and one of them has said, I thought you were out of your head when you put certain things together, but she said, now I understand that we're fitting together and we're making more progress as a unified group than we would have made separately. Right. So combining disciplines created more progress than it would have otherwise.
Okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense. I could definitely see how that happened. I think that's about all I can think of. Any other reflections or stories or anything?
Well, the one thing that has always impressed me about Clemson, first thing that impressed me, when I first got off the bus from Unicoi County, Tennessee, back in 1944, and I got off the bus down in front of Bowman Field, right across the street from Bowman Field, and I sort of fell in love with the place then just from the way it looked, because I thought it was a beautiful campus.
Definitely.
But then over the years and since, I found that the spirit of Clemson people and the love that our graduates and our students have for this university have created a oneness that is still is extremely impressive to me because, people used to be so proud of their, and still are, so proud of their Clemson rings. And people who find another Clemson person in the Philippines or in Europe or wherever it might have been during the war, it was just like finding a brother or a sister somewhere. And I don't know, the Clemson spirit has always been a tremendous, impressive thing to me. And I think it still exists today, even though we're a much larger institution. And back when I was here, it was all male and it was military. But, and some people have said it was because of the military that it was like a big fraternity.
Yeah.
But now, it still exists, in my opinion, and I think in most people's opinion, that it's not just that, it's Thomas Green Clemson, and many people have said there's something in these hills. Joe Sherman said it years ago. He said there's something in these hills that unites us, and I think that still exists today.
Did you run into Clemson grads or somebody or people that were enrolled at Clemson while you were in the service then?
Yeah, I did meet, most of them were officers because of the ROTC back then. But yeah, I remember when I was called back in the service during the Korean War, and I was being processed down at Fort Jackson in Columbia, and one of the officers that I was going down a line being processed, and he looked at my name and he said, "You played football for Clemson, did you?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I did." He said, "Why don't you play football for Fort Jackson?" And Coach Howard had said, "Don't let them talk you into playing service football because you'll get hurt. You won't be in shape. They won't get you in as good a shape as I would." And he said, anyway, this officer said, "Don't you want to play football for Fort Jackson?" And I said, "Well, I don't think I do." And he said, "Well, you'll get about 4 weeks brush-up training and then you'll be on your way to Korea." And I said, "Well, where do I sign up for football?" so I did play football for Fort Jackson, and I did get hurt, not bad, but got one knee a little banged up. But anyway, that was just a funny story that Coach Howard said, "Don't do it," and this guy persuaded me to do it because the alternative was football or Korea, and I took football.
That is a good story.
Yeah.
Okay. That's all I can think of then. If you don't have anything else, then.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Just remember that Clemson is a great place, and we all should love it and give it our best.
Oh, I totally. There's nothing. I've been to other college football games, and I'd never been to a game in Death Valley before the Georgia game this year.
Oh.
And even in the upper deck, I've never seen anything like it. Just the echo of it back and forth across the stadium is just phenomenal. We'll do it. We'll be walking around campus and we'll see like a tour and we'll have like 5 people and we do a cadence count just to mess with them. But or we'll do it like in a basketball game. But there's never enough people there. I want to hear it. I want to go in the stadium because there's nothing like hearing it echo back and forth across the stadium.
It's great.
It's a phenomenal feeling.
And I've heard national TV announcers say this on the television. They said, "Here we are in a town of 13 or 14,000 people, plus the students, and we got 80,000 people in the stadium."
And you're like, where do they all come from? Well, the entire town's here, the entire student body's here, and then everybody else in South Carolina.
They come from Georgia, North Carolina, and all over the state of South Carolina. It really is something.
One of my friends said he was down in Georgia, and for Georgia they were playing a no-name team, but he was saying that even like when we play a no-name team, you walk around and be like, tailgaters are covering campus, and he's like, his friend's like, all right, we'll go down to the tailgates, and they walked onto one field, and it was like half full. It's like, this is tailgating? It's like, you haven't been to Clemson, have you? Like, they don't know how to do it right.
Well, you know, we got a tailgating award for some magazine.
Second year in a row, we're the #1 tailgating school in the nation.
It really is a wonderful place.
For just 20,000 people, you'd never guess.
That's right. That's right.
We could be as good at everything we are. Alright, we can shut this off then.